Good afternoon. My name is Jason, and I'm glad that you've taken some time to come on out on a Sunday afternoon to share a little bit of the story of the Old Connecticut Path that my ancestors followed from Cambridge on down to Hartford, and also Dorchester, following the Bay Path, and connecting to the Connecticut Path, going on down to Windsor and Wethersfield. And this was back in the 1630s, so they were among the first of the English settlers, the first white people to travel through Ashland and Hopkinton. They didn't stick around, they were busy going west. But I'll share you some of the story with you about the path and about Hopkinton and Ashland's place along the path. Now, some questions have come up about the picture here. These are all from the Hartford cemetery and monuments for those founders who went down to Connecticut and established the city, the town of Hartford, and also were involved in Wethersfield and Windsor, the first three towns on the Connecticut Valley. I want to start off, usually you say thank you at the end, but as I've already told you, things have changed so much with the internet that we learn a lot more about things when we go on the internet. If you're curious about something, and the folks here at the Hopkinton Historical Society and Historical Commission posted a lot of wonderful information that helped me in my research. The Open Space Committee and the Trails Club have some marvelous guides for exploring some of the areas that I actually found were along the path. And not to leave out our friends from Ashland. Ashland Historical Society has a number of articles posted on their website that helped explain some of the places that I found along the way, helped me to find some of the places. In the Open Space Committee in Ashland, again, had some really wonderful guides to help me to find the greenest wild places that exist in Ashland that are also a part of the path. And I also want to thank from Ashland, Cliff Wilson of the Ashland Historical Society, and Ray Gendro over here from the Hopkinton Historical Society, because they've reached out to me, again, over the internet. They found this and made a connection with me, and were gracious enough to pass the word along and invite me down to share this with you. Now, this path I found, I thought I was chasing the path of my ancestors, and I had to change it to our ancestors because the folks who went down to Connecticut from Cambridge down to the Connecticut Valley had lots of children, and if you had one ancestor then, you're related to a whole lot of others. And so when I talk to a group like this, I usually wind up with a couple of cousins that we have a relationship. Either their ancestors went down, or we're related in some ways going back in time. So it really is focused from what started as my retirement project, my family history, going from being a psychologist and a special education director, to saying, well, what am I going to do? It's sort of like that, when you go back to school in September and they say, what did you do in your summer vacation? Well, this is sort of like, what did I do in my first bit of retirement? It was to take on the challenge of chasing down the path of my ancestors. And as I did this, I was fortunate that my uncle and my father were involved in compiling all the genealogy, the really hard stuff. I don't have to go dig them out. I can just look them up in the family histories. And in Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford, I had all these relatives. And again, as you start getting into this, when you have one, you have a bunch. But my main ancestor that you'll hear about is Thomas Hooker and Roger Newton, who married into the Hooker family. We'll get to that in a moment. But these were the three major towns, and Hartford was founded by a group that came down from Cambridge. Windsor from Dorchester, there were groups that went down. And Wethersfield was groups from Watertown. And they all came through, tramping through Ashland and Hopkinton on their way west. Now, in doing this project, I didn't realize what I was getting into. I figured that this would all be pretty well beaten down by now, because it was 375 years. I'm pretty late in the process, but I didn't find a lot, even with the powers of the internet. There wasn't a lot out there. I can tell you now, if you use the program and you type in Old Connecticut Path in Google, you'll find out it's now all about me. There was nothing before, and now it's just about me and my life. As I said, what it's led to is a whole bunch of people from across the country making connections with their families who traveled this way. And I've been trying to share this with folks along the way down through the historical societies, down through Connecticut. As I did this project, I was really looking and saying, well, first of all, can we figure out what might be a reasonable, probable route? And then, as you get out there, because we've had so much change in our world and this environment, can you really find places along the way that give you some sense of the feeling of the wilderness that they might have encountered? And then the third is really looking at, because this has been over such a long period of time, what kinds of artifacts do we see along the way? We might not see artifacts from their passage in the 1630s, but we see the artifacts of people who followed and settled along the way. And I found that I think I've got answers to those questions. It surprised myself. It took a couple of years to get it pulled together, and I'll share it with you now. Now, going back to about 1631, Governor Winthrop recorded in his journal that the sachem from Connecticut, Hopkinton, came up from Connecticut and said, for those of you who are all of the same era of the commercials by Ernie Block, but he'd say, come on down. Well, the chief said, come on down to Connecticut. And I don't know if his descendants are really ruing that and saying, what was he thinking, inviting these people down, because they made a mess of things. But it's on record that he came up and said, this is wonderful land in Connecticut, really, we want you to come. And along with him was this Indian Jack Straw, who came and was the interpreter. And Jack Straw learned his English in England. He was picked up by Walter Raleigh and brought back to England. So I'm sure he learned really proper English and came back, and he set up his homestead just a little bit up the road here in Westboro. So we'll hear a little more about him. But there's another connection locally. These folks came down in 1633, and John Oldton from Watertown went down to Connecticut. Was the first white man in 1633. So he came on through here, and the rest has been, everybody's been passing through here since then. Now, at that time, there really weren't any maps. The routes were known to the natives, but even as late as 1660, a map of New England really didn't have much detail to it. They knew it was near the coast, but the interior was no man's land. But there was a route that went from the Bay at Boston and Cambridge on down to the Connecticut Valley that the natives knew and were able to provide guidance to the settlers to travel on down. Now, as part of my research, a fellow David Greco lived out in, born in Grafton, now lives in Arizona and is retired. He's doing research, yeah, this is internet stuff. He's doing research on Indian paths in Arizona about Massachusetts, and he sent me this map, and he said, you know, there wasn't really one simple, like, super highway. There would be a maze of interconnected paths that the natives knew the best ways, depending on what the conditions were to get from one place to another. So travel to Connecticut very likely would have required the assistance of the natives to be able to guide people who had no wilderness experience when they arrived, to be able to travel safely 100 or more miles through the wilderness. In looking at the story of the path, much of the story comes down in relation to Reverend John Eliot and his establishment of the praying Indian towns and Indian villages along the route between Boston on down to Woodstock, which is about as far as he was able to reach in his time before King Philip's War, that helped establish a route that would have been followed from the bay on down through Quag, and there are a lot of different spellings of that, across Ashland and Hopkinton and Grafton and Sutton and on down to the area of Woodstock, and then across the highlands of Indian County down to the Connecticut Valley. And in doing my research, this seems to work out pretty well, giving us an explanation of at least some of the points along the way. In doing the story of the path, over time there's been various tellings of the story, and some of them have this vision that Thomas Hooker, my ancestor, he set out with his entire congregation and a bunch of cattle. He had a compass in hand, like he was the great wilderness and wild man out there wandering for 2 weeks through the wilderness with his compass and stumbled somehow into the Connecticut Valley. That was one version that Thomas Hutchinson was governor of Massachusetts in the 1700s proposed. And another is this more kind of depicted in the romantic walk in the park. It was like a great camp meeting going down Connecticut. The trails they were following, the native trails, the Indian trails, basically were wide enough for a person to walk down. And they probably got widened out as they were driving cattle down, but they were still pretty narrow and would be very difficult to follow unless you had someone to guide you along the way. It'd be very easy to get lost and go in circles, as I have done. My GPS plots in some areas, it's very ugly because I go in a lot of circles in finding this. But fortunately, the story of the path is one that has captured attention across time and has been memorialized from Cambridge on to Wayland. Ashland has a monument to the path. You have your Bay Path here. Grafton has several. There's several monuments in Grafton going on over the hill to Woodstock and Ashford and on to Hartford. And it's been a story that's captured the imagination over time, and it's been memorialized. So again, we have other markers along the way. And so my task was really to say, okay, if you take these dots on the map, how do you connect them? And I'll share with you what I think is a reasonable representation of the route. They were traveling with, as you'll hear, 160 cattle when they left from Cambridge, with women and children. So I figured, and it seems to work out with what others think, is about 10 miles a day of progress along the path. So in breaking it out, we get an idea, at least an estimate of what their progress might have been like. And the first day we in Cambridge brought them out just a little bit beyond 128 to the area of Weston, which we know now is a crossing point. At that time, that area was the West Meadows of Watertown, and people didn't live there. That was the wilderness. And there are those who inside 128 still think anything beyond 128 is wilderness. Although it's gotten better with 495. Now some people, like the weathermen, at least get it out to 495. They're Holden, and they just stand in front of our area. We don't exist. So day 1 was out to Weston. Day 2 was down to Framing, and day 3 brought us over to about the area of Whitehall Pond. And there's some tradition of encampment by the Hooker congregation around Whitehall. You get a chance to see that shortly. Over the hill to the area of Sutton. And there's some question you have, well, where does the Bay Path fit in? The Bay Path came out from the area of Dorchester and Roxbury, and came across and seems to have joined with the Connecticut Path together. They ran together through from Framingham on down to about the area of Grafton, and then reached off again. So they came here and said, I thought we were on the Bay Path. You are, and you were also on the Connecticut Path. They were following these routes, and they were just branches of trails along the way. The Bay Path from Grafton heading west, pretty much paralleling the Mass Turnpike. So even 3-4 centuries later, the main route west across Massachusetts travels along, parallels the Native Indian Trail to Springfield and beyond. From there, from Sutton on down across Woodstock and Ashford and down to the Willimantic River is an area of extraordinary wilderness that's available still, and it was a surprise to me that you'd be able to find that today. And from the Willimantic River, the trail branched, as I see it, branched to the Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield would be branching from there. So just as an overview, you get about 10 days, and they would have been hard days walking. 10 miles on trail that's unimproved is a pretty good walk. And if you're doing it with women and children and elderly people, families going down, it was a major undertaking. Going through the wilderness, and the folks who were doing it were not wilderness savvy. They were coming from England. So really, as I now have the sense of where the route is, I had to confront the fact that I got an idea where they came from, but I don't really know why. And for us, my generation, our generation, I think there's this kind of black hole that we have in our understanding of history. That we all know about Plymouth Rock, because we know both sailed right up to Plymouth, and everybody got out, they stepped on the rock, and Thanksgiving. That's how it's all been handed down that way. And really, about 150 years almost, we jump down, and the next thing we really know, and we have is the Lexington and Concord. We say, oh yeah, I know that. Plymouth, Lexington and Concord, what happened in between? I don't know. There's a big gap in what we know, and this seemed to be a time where there were great changes occurring. And for you to understand the story of the path, I had to understand something about the story of the people. And central to the story from my telling is the story of Thomas Hooker, who was a minister, came over in 1633 and went on to be one of the founders of Hartford. And trying to understand his story in the context of the times that he was living in, to be able to understand why these people marched together with him and others in different groups down to Connecticut. And as someone who didn't grow up in Connecticut, I had to find out that, he was a scholar at Cambridge University, a minister in England. He's considered a reformer of his time. We would have a hard time seeing the reforms, but they were there, and they were significant. And he was considered the founder of Hartford in Connecticut. The New England Confederation he had a role in, and it was one of our first attempts to bring colonies together for mutual aid and benefit. He's been considered a statesman because he was called upon his record, even though he went to Connecticut, he kept coming back to Massachusetts to help mediate and resolve problems. And this thing, Father of American Democracy, which is a kind of a huge thing to lay on someone. We'll try to explain that. Some pivotal points in his life before they came over was that Hooker was a lecturer in Chelmsford in England from 1626 to 1629. And Chelmsford was sort of a hotbed of the Puritan movement. And Hooker, in his lectures kept drawing increasingly large crowds from among the local populace, and his fame as a preacher extended out, and it was said that by his peers, by other ministers, that none could compare with Thomas Hooker's capability to take Scripture and lessons and translate it into ways that people could bring into their lives and lead them towards their understanding of salvation. So he was drawing big crowds, and also during this time he lived just outside of Chelmsford at a place in Little Baydow, in a place called Cuckoo's Farm, which is still there. And at that farm, he and his assistant, Reverend John Elliott, established a school. And also at that place at the Cuckoo's Farm, all the young ministers from across the countryside kept coming to speak with and meet with Thomas Hooker. So there were two things that were happening simultaneously in Hooker's life and his family together here. Is that he was influencing the people and drawing them in, and he was drawing in the young ministers who were then in turn going out and influencing their congregations. And you say, well, that's a great thing. Except King Charles, who was on the throne at that time, took exception with that basically he had a decree, it really came down on the Puritans, that it's my, in modern terms, it's my way or the highway. There's no deviation from the Church of England's view, and the Puritans were pretty far out away from the Church of England. They were espousing reforms to the church that weren't acceptable to the king, and brought on severe suppression by the king. And his enforcer, William Laud, who was the Archbishop of London, and later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is, as I understand, is sort of like the Pope of England. And Laud's role was in suppressing the Puritan movement, and most prominent among that group was Thomas Hooker. So Hooker was called before a Star Chamber tribunal, and his friends paid the bond, and they said, get out of the country. If you go in, they will put you in jail, and you will not get out. And there were, I have other ancestors that spent 2-3 years in jail for heresy. So it was serious business that they were up against as Puritans and their beliefs. Hooker went to Holland, came back undercover to England, and then his family left England when Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, as did many other Puritans and ministers. There was a big surge in 1633 beyond because they believed that there wasn't much hope of making change in England. But before he left, he gave a sermon and he said, listen, there will be a war in England. Things were that bad. And he was right. In 1640 or thereabouts, the English Civil War broke out, and it was anything but civil. There was tremendous loss of life. There was destruction in the country. It was religious reasons, economic conditions, and political. It really contributed to reshaping England. And as we look at this, it had some effect in, I think, the roots of the American Revolution and our own evolution as a country. Two things that came up with this Civil War: Archbishop Laud was executed during the Civil War, and the king, King Charles I, was beheaded. So think about this, a group of people coming over because of the suppression of their beliefs and had to leave England and their families and their lives there, come to America. And the folks that they were supporting in England overthrew the king. And what that passes on a few to, say, 100 years down the line in our history as we evolve as a country. They spent 2 months together on a ship, much like the Mayflower, full of death. And they paid for their own passage, and whole families came on board. And this would have been a harrowing journey across the Atlantic at that time. And they arrived in 1633 at what was then Newtown, which is now Cambridge. And within 3 years, they packed up and left for Connecticut. They had sufficient differences with the rule here in Massachusetts that they needed to find a more accepting environment or create an environment for the just society that they felt should be in existence. So again, Governor Winthrop reported at the end of May 1630 that Mr. Booker and his entire congregation headed off to Connecticut, driving 160 cattle, and fed on milk on the way. Now, as I said, one of the things that was unusual in this migration was that the entire congregation went and they brought families. They came over from England with their families. They traveled to Connecticut with their families. Other parts of the country, men came over, and then they suddenly discovered there was this disparity in the number of men versus the number of women. Then they realized they had a problem. Here in New England, families came together, and that had a tremendous, powerful effect of groups packing up and traveling through the wilderness as the Booker family did. And my connection is Mary Booker, who's the second daughter, married Roger Newton, who's my ancestor. And Roger went down to Connecticut to prepare for the ministry in the house of Thomas Hooker. So he prepared for the ministry and then married the daughter. I think that there was probably a little plan there to match the two of them up. But that's where the family connection came in. So families went down to Connecticut, and that family connection seems to persist even to this day of those who've gone down to Connecticut. Some came back this way, some went to different parts of the country. And that march has been memorialized on the state capitol as an important part of their heritage of the march to Connecticut by the Hooker congregation.
Why does his wife carry on with her?
You know, I took it out of this presentation, but it's a good question. They thought, well, you hear later that she was an invalid. No, she had a 3-year-old, and she had a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old child. And doing the math, when she was traveling across the North Atlantic, she was pregnant. So I think that, she was saying, you took me away from home in England. You took me on this 2-month voyage. Now you want me to walk 2 weeks to Connecticut with these young children? I think there was a little accommodation. Traveling across the hills and following this out, it was an extraordinarily difficult journey. Even though they had trails to follow and probably had the safest ways to go. But as you come over the hills, there's the last place that you come over the hills and you actually get to see the Connecticut Valley, and you go, oh my God. And they must have been going, oh my God, what did we get into? We were walking through the wilderness, 2 weeks sleeping on the ground. And then you get to this vista where you're looking out this magnificent valley. And they truly must have felt that they were reaching this promised land. It was just so beautiful coming down into the valley. And it's a very rich, fertile area. So they picked 12. And the chief who came up wasn't lying. He said, this is good land. But they weren't done with their journey when they felt it. Their journey continued in a way that they met together as congregations in Hartford in 1638. And again, Thomas Hooker, in his role as leader, stood up and he led a sermon to the community based on a passage from Deuteronomy about choosing wise men as your leaders. As you think about that today, I wonder how that would go. But he gave 3 reasons, 3 things that he thought were important that were actually transcribed down, is that it's the people who must rule. and that this is a gift given directly from God to the people. And the privilege of election belongs to the people, but it's to be used carefully. In his day, you could buy a vote with a little trip to the tavern, some ale. There were other inducements to get you to vote one way or the other. He said, you know, you've got to be thinking about the good of the congregation. And the power to appoint to limit your authorities, the people who you put in power, the people have that authority and power. They can limit the people who are in power, and they can restrict them, and they can remove them. So coming up, this is their 375th anniversary of what they call the Fundamental Orders of the Path. They, as three communities, the three men of the three communities, voted on the Fundamental Orders, which I found was the first written constitution to establish a government. And later was a model that evolved to something that we see in our own Constitution. So the Fundamental Orders brought together a couple of covenants. There was this covenant from God that Hooker discussed about God gave you the authority and power to create government. And so the relationship is you have the authority as people without it going through a king or anyone else. And the orders themselves list the rights for people, protections, limits on power. They corrected the abuses that they experienced in England. And key thing in there is that nowhere in the document does it say anything about the king. They established a government without any authority from the king. It came from the people. And so the descendants from there, we can see when we read them, is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They have elements that you can see. It started back up here with the Fundamental Orders. So in essence, when I said, you know, if we think of the revolution starting with Lexington and Concord, well, it probably started even much earlier back here with these folks who went down to Connecticut and established a law to create a just and orderly society, a godly society, and it became a model that influenced later thinking that was incorporated in our own Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. So that, I think, is where the magic of the story is. We have the people who are doing this pilgrimage from England, 2 months at sea, 2 weeks through the wilderness, and then they not just establish their lives, but establish a new order. What happened to the story? I said, gee, this is a great story. Why am I finding out about it? It doesn't seem to be out there. Well, they had lots of children, and those children carried the stories of their parents and their travels west across the country. It was no longer the story of coming from England to Massachusetts or going to Connecticut. It came from Connecticut to Ohio, and then our ancestors that went west to Nebraska and over the mountains to California and to the West Coast. But there was another story that was going on here. All through this, I kept the sense that there had to be something that was keeping them going. As hard as this trip was, what kept them going across through these hardships and the sacrifices that they were making to make this journey? And as I kept trying to parse this out, the answer, this is actually the seal from Connecticut that was adopted in 1640 by the people who went to Connecticut. And I'm not going to give a Latin, but it translates, he who transplants that sustains. And the symbolism of the vines goes back to the tribes of Israel being brought out of Egypt. And as I looked at this further, their belief as Puritans, it was among the Puritan belief that in their coming to New England and their leaving England, they were like the tribes of Israel being brought out of Egypt. And the groups, the congregations that went to Connecticut were like the Thomas Hooker and his congregation truly had the experience of traveling over the ocean and traveling together through the wilderness in a way that they literally lived that story of the migration, the Exodus. And I found this beautiful passage, and I have to think that while they were crossing the Atlantic with their families below deck in storm-tossed waters, their children are saying, well, why are we doing this? And there's a story there of, we're doing this, we're being brought out of bondage. Just as the Egyptians were brought out, or the Israelites were brought out of bondage, and brought to the land promised to their ancestors, the promised land. And if you keep the law, you'll live there forever. They had strong connection to this belief that they were coming to the promised land and that they were fulfilling something in the way of this creation of a better, more just society. So you take those two stories of, here's what we went through. We went from here to here, and you add the purpose of a divine purpose. That we're doing something that's bringing us out of bondage to deliver us to a promised land. If we keep God's law, which they created because God gave, Thomas Hooker said, you can create the law. So the law they created was God's law. If you keep the law, then God will sustain you. Powerful story that I think I've woven into, you think of what is the American story of promise that's drawn people over the centuries, that draws people even today to come to America. And that causes us to stand up for things that we believe in America. That it's tied to a larger purpose, which I believe they shared in their journey here. So you've all been very good. Okay, now what about Hopkinton? This is a Hopkinton presentation. And I have to tell you that story because if you understand the people that came, then you can hopefully appreciate the value of the places that are here that you know. And Hopkinton has some real Connecticut connections that I can share with you, and then some places that you can actually go. And the first big one is Edward Hopkins, who came over. He didn't walk down the path. He was well-to-do enough, so he took the boat directly to New Haven, where he found that colony, and then went up to Hartford. He was a merchant in England. He was well-to-do and a Puritan. And so, like many others who came over, the folks who came over at that time, they weren't poor. They were middle-class people, or some even wealthy, like Edward Hopkins. And he was governor of Connecticut. They kept re-electing him. Connecticut, under the fundamental orders, you could be governor for 1 year. You couldn't have successive terms. So you'd be elected 1 year, then someone else would be in, and you'd be elected back in. They thought that highly of him, and he went back to England during after the English Civil War, and was Lord of the Admiralty, where he died in England. So we have a wealthy man, merchant, whose wife was in ill health, so he created a trust. He said, she's not going to live very long. I'll let my friends manage the money, and here's what I want you to do with the money. I want you to use it for breeding up of hopeful youths in the way of learning, both at the grammar school and college. And the funds were used for the Hopkins School in New Haven, which still exists, the Hopkins School in Hadley, which is now a public school, a school in Cambridge, which has been absorbed by the town, by the city of Cambridge. And he gave a big grant. They gave a big grant to Hartford, which they turned around and bought this piece of property out here that turned around and named it Hopkinton after Edward Hopkins. Okay, so we have a Connecticut connection. And here's Hopkinton. It was quite a big deal. I think they got it for like 500 pounds. So you say, I don't know what that translates to now, but I think they got a real deal on it. And across this land, if we go right across this red line, is the Connecticut Path, the Bay Path, coming across what's now Ashland and Hopkinton. So there's a real connection. Folks came through here on their way to Connecticut. Hopkins, who was an important person in Connecticut history, bequeathed a large amount of money that Hartford turned around and used, bought the land, and we now have Hopkinton. You folks from Ashland, down in Connecticut, I think they call them daughter towns, that are descended from the mother town. So there's a large tract of land that came to be in Hopkinton. I'm going to take you on the ground level here for a few minutes to bring you across so that you can see some places that are part of the path. And it's a little easier. We're going to take that day that they went from Framingham on up to Whitehall, and so you get an idea of some of the places you can go today. If you start down in Framingham and over in Wayland, they have these street signs that actually say Old Connecticut Path. So it was one of the easier places for me to figure out where it was. All of the signs. When you get into Framingham, on Route 126, there's Gleason, or Gallagher Park at Gleason Pond, which would be about the area that would be their second day stop. So if it gives you an idea, that's about downtown, it's now downtown Framingham, would have been about the place that they stopped on their second day of walking. And we can see that that also was where the Bay Path likely joined in. In the history of Framingham, Temple said, well, the Connecticut Path went across the beaver dams, and it went on this big roundabout way to get over to where Ashland is. And thanks to the folks over, Steve Lepkew over at Ashland Historical Society, I found that George Higley in the late 1800s actually went and did a search of the deeds of the properties and found a much more direct route that would lead past Lake Washington and over the hill to Ashland. And as we go from there, just as a quick overview, past Pelt Rock, and up over Franklin Road, and on out towards 495, passing through Hopkinton Center. But one of the most beautiful places in this area to walk and really have some connection with the path is there at Wildwood Cemetery in Ashland. We'll take a couple of places that we can go. The Bay Circuit Trail, I found, actually goes along the edge of the Wildwood Cemetery and leads uphill and onto a trail that leads out to this place that's right behind the Ashland High School. And I know that, again, from the internet looking at this, there's some controversy in Ashland about the high school was built in the area of where they believe the Old Connecticut Path crossed, and also this place called the Devil's Den, which is a talus cave that was probably used as a place of connection by the natives. They, in their ceremonial life, they would use caves to go in and meditate and get closer to these spirits. The cave actually got kind of pushed back. The hill that it was in got excavated for pine fields, but they did make an effort to preserve the cave. If you work really hard, you can get there. And it has been filled in substantially, but it is in the back of the high school. And as you walk back down through the Wildwood Cemetery, if you walk about the center of the cemetery, it seems to be about where George Higley was showing the path would be. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful walk with Magunko Hill out in the distance. Now, this is the internet age, and when I posted this picture on our Facebook, on the Old Connecticut Path Facebook page, this picture had the highest number of views. It's like over 800 views. It's like everybody wanted to see it, and then they were sharing. They're saying, folks from Hopkinton or Ashland saying, you have the most beautiful place and it is gorgeous. Now, Hinckley also continued the path across the street from the cemetery. So if you stand at the cemetery and look at the gate, and you turn around, there's this cart path right beyond there. It's not open to the public now, but I just took some pictures to get an idea. It's right in line with where he said in the late 1800s. It leads on down to, from the cemetery, it leads on down across through the woods to Pelt Rock. And we'll take a look. Pelt Rock is another place I found thanks to the Ashland Historical Society webpage. I had an article on finding Pelt Rock, which is just a short walk from the street on Cold Spring Road. And it's inscribed, a crossing place on the Old Connecticut Path. The inscription was there around 1917, 18, somewhere in that area. You're familiar with the McGumco and Paul Brodeur. I believe they actually spoke here on this a couple of years ago. Was one of the Craig Indian Village areas, and the path, as you can see, on the green line comes right around through Franklin Road. And this was the area of native settlement. And thinking about the natives and learning more about their place, that I'm finding that they lived here at least 2,500 years ago. And over at the Cedar Swamp, up towards the other end of Hopkinton, the archaeological evidence is that there was native activity 7,000 years ago. So we're talking about people living here in villages that are now up there on McGumco Hill where the cornfields are. We have McMansions. This was native land. It was rich land that was homeland to these people for literally thousands of years. And their trail came right through here on Franklin Road. Another wonderful place to walk and easily accessible is the Ashland State Forest from the Senior Center, just walking in. The woodland there gives you some sense of what was the world like when the natives were here. These streams running down along the road. The reservoir wasn't there because there were these smaller ponds in this area. And across the street from the Senior Center is the Franklin Road, which is agreed as the Bay Path and the Old Connecticut Path. And I found that the marker that is now, there's one in the center of Hopkinton. There originally was one there at the corner of Franklin Road. There's a third one for the Bay Path. For you folks who want to go out from 20, there's one out in Broomfield. Now the Bay Path and the Old Connecticut Path followed up over Franklin Road. And there's some wonderful green land, open space at Wild Woods and Brook Hollow and Deer Run that are walking trails that you can, again, explore some of the woods, get a sense of what it is to step off the roadway. But Franklin Road also has other attractions. If you go on it as a old country road lined with stone walls and these classic farmhouse here, the Singletary Farm on Franklin Road that goes back to mid-1700s. These beautiful places, and actually this is close to this time because there's trees flowering there. Now as you come up the hill, you're all familiar with this place up the center here. We have the Bay Path sign, which I believe was the Historical Society involved in the restoration of this. I know it was recently restored, and the green and the marker commemorating the first meeting house here that was built in Hopkinton, right on the main street. So it was a meeting place for the people who came here to settle, that they built their meeting house on this Indian path. And it's a meeting place now, as you all know. That folks have traveled from all over the world to come to run on what is and what was an Indian path that our earliest settlers came tracking on. So as we travel a little bit west from Hopkinton Center, there are a couple of variations I'll bring up for you that lead around Whitehall Pond. And Levi Badger Chase, around 1900, laid out what he believed was the bay path, and it works out pretty well, except this piece that I had some question about. He said it came out, went along Whitehall Pond, but what he was showing was really Whitehall Reservoir. The pond itself was actually much smaller. And so he had it hooking way around to the north and then doing a turn and head over to Radford. Harold Ayers wrote a book, researched a book on the Great Path. It was published in 1940. He came out here to Hopkinton in the 30s, met with Harry Cheney, who was a resident up around Bear Hill. And he said, you know, we've kind of got this route that goes out towards Whitehall Pond, and then he just stopped. He said, and then it jumps over to Grafton. But he didn't really explain where it went. But you can see on the map here, Whitehall Pond was very much smaller originally than Whitehall Reservoir, which would fill that entire area. But if you do go out Pond Street, you're traveling really an ancient way. It undoubtedly was a native path leading down to Whitehall Pond. And yeah, this is a good time of year to take a drive out there if you haven't recently. Because you'll start to see some of the flowering shrubs. And as you come down the hills of the pond, this is right from the road, a wonderful vista on Whitehall Pond, or the area of Whitehall Pond. I wish with a small pond would have been within this larger area, this south end of the reservoir. And just a bit beyond is Bear Hill Cemetery, which I found was, again, with the archives that are online, the Hopkinton Historical Commission is the oldest cemetery in Hopkinton, and has soldiers, 2 soldiers who were killed in the King Philip's War interred there, and also is on the site of an Indian village. And they have found a storage bin, a foreign storage bin, adjacent to the site of the cemetery. So it had been in use prior to it being a cemetery. It had been used by the natives as a camping site and village site. I haven't found this by walking out to it, but right adjacent to this area was this thing, a stone mound that was a creek constructed by the natives as a sweat house, sweat lodge. And going back, there were pictures from 1946 that showed it being substantially intact. The Historic Commission took something in '89, and much of it has been lost. In the spirit, life, and health of the natives, they used sweat lodges as a place to literally sweat out bad spirits. And they would keep these stone structures to a level where they could go in and spray water on stones and create steam and then sweat the bad spirits out. So there are a number of things that are shown as connections to this area of Hopkinton in Whitehall Pond, and I wasn't really satisfied with Badgers sending it up across the upper end or Ayers bringing it down this way. There was an alternative that worked really well. That's in the history of Hopkinton by Earl Osborne. And he described the route that came down and across the upper end of Whitehall Pond and into the area of the Mineral Springs and Bear Hill Cemetery and the Stone Mine. And it was really, I had to go out to find it and walk it to see what's possible. And thanks to the folks at the Conservation Commissions here in town, they have a wonderful trail guide of the places you can walk. And if you look across the trail guide, there are links Bipsley and Town Forest and Whitehall State Park with trails that you can walk up the hill from Winter Street on the line, and I walked through the woods and down right to where it would run into what's now 495. The connection that would make it really obvious if we were doing it was blocked when they constructed Route 495 and they rerouted the highway Route 135. The connection isn't obvious unless you walk backwards from Windsor Street. And if you walk here today, you can walk up these deeply groove-worn paths leading up the hill, and then over the hill towards 495. And going down to the reservoir, you can see the upper end of the original Whitehall Pond has now been widened, and the flooded cedar forest that was there, that was flooded when they constructed the reservoir. It leads over to, there was a tradition that was picked up of their camp on the journey was in the area of Whitehall Pond. And if we say Whitehall Pond was the smaller pond, and it came across this area, it brings you right into a place where the mineral springs, the Hopkinton mineral springs were, Bear Hill Cemetery, the stone structure, the sweat lodge would be over in this area. That there's a history of being connected with very early native contact here in Hopkinton. So I went out to investigate, and once again, Hopkinton resident and veterinary pathology James Regan, as part of his Eagles project, went out and created signed and interpreted boards for the Hopkinton mineral springs that you can walk down a very short path from Lyford Road. And among the things that he had on the interpretive board was this map from 1831 that was noted with, here's the pond, here's Indian camps, here's the mineral springs, here's the cemetery, here's Indian camps, and if we lay the trail right on it, we can see that even going back very early, there were the stories of this being an important cross place along a route in Hopkinton's history, which gives us a nice connection when we go out there and we can walk. There's a field off of Donald Pass that is within the state forest, that's a part of this area. The trails along the area of the mineral springs and down along the mineral springs are in this area. You can go and walk today. So bring this towards completion so you can idea where the places are. Here's the mineral springs area, and looking west, there was another way to get up the hill and on your way to Grafton. From there, it sounds like Grafton would be a long ways away. It's really probably a half day's walk. And just across the Spring Street, there is a roadway that actually shows up on the geological survey map leading up the hill. And I suspect working the details would have likely crossed under the pike and run parallel to it, and then down Bay Mountain Road. So as we get near to the close here, so that you understand the context of the area, this was a crossroads, just a short ways west from here. It's important today as a crossroads if we think of the interstates and the Turnpike and 495, but it was a crossroads then for native travel. With the Narragansett Trail that ran from Narragansett Bay, you could go all the way up to the Maine coast. And the Bay Path and the Connecticut Path coming across, going from the Massachusetts Bay on down to the Connecticut Valley. And right up there at the top of the hill is where Jack Straw set up shop. And you could see his interpretive business would be just doing very well with the people traveling along the paths on the English settlers to get guidance on the route. And if you go on up there, you can see the monument here. And Westboro has a number of monuments available that they put up about the trail going through town. And from there, it goes over the hill and down this very old portion of Fay Mountain Road and on its way into Grafton. So there are places today that you can get out and go that are part of this Bay Path and Connecticut Path that were important in the lives of the native people, the Indians, in their lives here, and go back not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years of use. And those early pioneers, those first settlers traveling through on the first westward migration to the Connecticut Valley, and later settlement coming out to this area and Ashland and Hopkinton. Now, this whole journey has taken many twists and turns for me. It started as my own one-person obsession. It's turned into something that other people are joining in on through videos, through website. But I've really come to the conclusion after doing these presentations like this that one of the key things to help preserving the story is for folks to actually have the opportunity to go out and connect with it yourselves. And fortunately, there are places that are extraordinarily beautiful places to drive, that are connected and take you along portions of the path, and where you can get out and walk. And there's some of the walks are really very easy, gentle. Some are challenging. But depending on your level and what you would like to experience, there's a range there that will lead you from, as I work on this, from Cambridge and Boston on down to Hartford. We're getting a good chunk done. But if you go on under Google and you type Old Connecticut Path Walks and Tours, it's on your brochure. And you just click driving tours, it'll lead down to a page where you can select driving tours and walks. And as far east as I've got a driving tour from 495 at West Main Street here in Hopkinton, over the hill through Westboro and on down to Grafton. And you can see the trail is a little bit straighter. With the turnpike going across, we have to do some twists and turns. But if you go on, there's actually GPS guidance and there are pictures and things that you can follow this route and explore some of the places to walk. And also on here, you'll find some of the walks, places to walk, and then continuing to work on adding them with guides so you can get out and walk in some of the places that are along the path. And we're starting to do some interpretive walks with groups of historical societies and conservation groups along portions of the path. And we have a couple coming up, and they're on your brochure. They'll be posted on the website for a walk out in 2 walks in Ashford. Ashford is celebrating their 300th anniversary this year. And we're doing 2 walks along the Connecticut Path as part of their celebration coming up in June. We're doing a walk in a special program with the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Woodstock in August. And we're just scheduling and working out the details of a walk at Crystal Pond in Eastford next October. And this is a way for the historical societies, the conservation commissions, the land trusts, the trails groups, to be able to bring people to places of natural beauty and then connect that with the history of the people who came through and who came and settled there. So we're finding that this is something that really draws people and makes a connection. Last fall we did a October walk in Wilmington up to Ashford, and we had 85 people come out on a beautiful October afternoon to walk a portion of the Connecticut Path and tell the story. So I brought you through and told you the story about the people, hopefully where it connects with us as a people, as Americans. They did something profound that set in motion a process that led to the Constitution and the government and the structure that we have, and really, I think, contributed to the story that we share as Americans, that American story of this is a promised land, and that it's a place that when push comes to shove, we will stand up for and show that it's worthy of preserving for ourselves and for our future generations. And there are places that are here in your own towns, in Ashland and Hopkinton, that you can go and you can have some of that direct connection with that land, that place that they came on their journey. And it's part of your journey. I hope that you'll leave here today and do some exploration and find the path and pass it on to those people that you know who would understand the importance of its place in their lives. So I want to thank you all. Thank the Hopkinton Historical Society. I want to thank the folks over in Ashland, the Historical Society, and those folks for having me here today and for lending support over the past years with this project. And I wish you well with your exploration. I'd be happy to entertain questions if you have some. And the ladies and gentlemen here have all sorts of refreshments in the back that it would be a shame to let go to waste. So thank you very much. You have a question?
The center of Hopkinton?
And your question, did it go right to the center? There's maybe a little variation, but it seems like that was the line that was being described as up Franklin Road towards the center. Osborne said it might have gone a little bit more around where the railroad tracks were, around that way. I went more with the center, and I'll tell you why I think it might have been. What I found with this, contrary to what I believed after traveling out west, and you go out west and you go through Indian reservations, and the most god-awful places, and you say this is an Indian reservation. What I found along this journey, along the path, the most beautiful places that were the most desirable to establish in towns tended to be on the path. And I think it might have been one of the mistakes the natives had in being so hospitable is that they took the English who were arriving and said, "Let us show you the way." Oh yeah, this is, and they brought them through all their villages and beautiful places. So Hopkinton, I'd say, where's the most beautiful, some of the most beautiful place for to pass through? It's near the center. And they also tended to go across the tops of hills, so on the high ground. So that's why I didn't think they went down towards the swamp. I think they stayed up on the hill. But there certainly, as you see, that there were networks of paths. If there was a reason to work around the spot, the natives would know that. But it's part of the evolution in my understanding of the natives is that they didn't really choose to live in terrible places. They actually lived in the most beautiful places. And they probably would have been better off if they took everyone and led them through the swamps. Let's go back to England. Other questions? Yes.
Any connection between the path and the Boston Post Road, at least in the Boston to Western Center?
There were several different, that's one of the things, there were several different paths. The natives didn't have just one, and the post road is likely to follow one path. The beautiful thing that I found, and it's really when as a psychologist, we talk about native intelligence. Well, the natives had, the Indians had real intelligence in laying out this path as it was from Cambridge, because it came along the land bridge between the Sudbury and the Charles River, so that there were no major river crossings in the other trails that became roads later had some difficult crossings. You look at the Sudbury River at times, it's difficult. But there were no bridges at that time, so they needed a route that would be from the ground. And when you think of the route, if you just go and follow it, they had crossed brooks and small streams. The major, in the Blackstone even out there, isn't a major river. The first real major river that gets scary is the Kennebec River down towards Thompson and Woodstock. So when I say native intelligence, this was a very intelligently laid out route that avoided what for us would be great difficulties without bridges. The stories of the natives is that they fucking love jumping in an icy river up to their neck and going across. But if you look at the clothing, dress, and experience of the English when they arrived here, that would be the last thing they'd want to do. If you stepped into deep water with heavy wool clothing on and strong currents, you'd probably be swept away. Yes?
I was wondering two things. One is, in your studies, did you find anything about which areas were already farmed by natives, as opposed to being what we think of as wilderness? And also, was there any way of distinguishing when you saw areas that are wild forest now between areas that are regrowth after the farming period versus anything that might actually, for what we think of as green forest?
See, this is where this question about the changes in the environment really leads you to a whole other realm of study. But as I'm doing research on the natives, they had great tracts of land that they had cleared by burning, where they could raise their crops, and they also burned the woods to make it clear for hunting, to clear out the underbrush. As we know, in later settlement, most of New England was clear cut. So most of what we see today is second, third, fourth growth forest. And there are some species of trees that have been eliminated, like the chestnut, and elm that we've lost. So there's been changes in the woods. So there were areas, the natives had ways of controlling the growth and clearing areas for planting. But they were also hunters and gatherers. They cleared the woods for hunting and using fire. Some of the wildest areas west of here, Connecticut has some interesting things to say. You got state aerial photos going back to the 1930s. So you can see the succession of areas that were cleared down the forest. But most of New England was cleared. So we can't see entirely the world of the forest, but there are places that, given the description of native trails, that you can get a sense of this is an approximation. You can't totally recreate it, but you can get an approximation. One of the places that we're doing a walk in June out in Ashford. We'll go down. There's a portion of the Natchog Trail, which is a hiking trail that is maintained by Connecticut Forest and Parks across the Natchog State Forest. In doing the research, their trail goes downhill in a portion right on top of the area that I and the Connecticut Historical Commission identified as the path. So we have a hiking trail, which I did an article that you can go on the Old Connecticut Path website that just was published in the Connecticut Forest and Parks in their edition on keeping paradise unpaved, which I think is important. That you can go out and you can actually walk a section of modern hiking trail that gives close approximation to the feel of an Indian trail, and that actually, as far as we can establish, has been used probably in excess of 400 years. here on the back of your neck starts rising like you go,
Yeah.
yeah, this is just spooky, but you find it. But there are places out there. Can we say with perfection, precision, they didn't have GPS, we can't say, this is the rock, and over there in Plymouth, you know, we all believe that, yeah, they actually pulled the boat up and they got up that rock. It's an area. It's something that we use to give us a sense of place. And there are places that we can use to give us a sense of place of this trail that connects us with the history. Oh, yeah. Oh, way out there.
Right down here. I had the privilege of being a trustee to Edward Hopkins Fund. It's now known in Hopkinton as the Old School Fund. That money is still dribbling down. It was up about 10 years ago. It was still dribbling in little account. The money is to be used for kind of like athletic equipment for the school children. We couldn't give it out as scholarships because that would be quite an effort. But, so the money paid for the first football legs one year. But that's where Edward Hopkins' money is still out there.
It's amazing that he set this aside. He died in like 1657, and money is still coming down and having a benefit. As a sidebar on the Hopkins story, his wife, he thought, wouldn't live very long. She was non-corpus mentis. And he thought, well, she won't live very long, so he set up this, provision in his will. She outlived him by 40 years. So all the trustees died. One thing she did do was that she wrote to her brother. Her name was Anne Gale. And she wrote to her brother over in England. And he sent over money, since she had no money because it was all tied up. He sent over money to help the school down in New Haven. Could have been Hopkins, but...
Well, that story you just told, that was why Hartford jumped in and grabbed the money because Yale didn't know enough to get up and go get it.
Well, there wouldn't be Hopkinton. Where would we be? It's one of those questions you say, where would we be if there was no Hopkinton? This hadn't happened.
Probably my question is, what was the connection between Edward Hopkins and Harvard University?
Other than his desire, and this was something that, this is part of the heritage of the people who came at that time, was that they almost immediately established these colleges for the purposes of bringing up ministers. And Harvard being the first. And my ancestor, Roger Newton, he started school at Cambridge in England, and then came over to finish his studies at Harvard for the ministry. And so Hopkins' request for raising up and for this specific purpose, schools were limited, there were a limited number of schools, but the legacy of this is that the graduates of Harvard went on to places like Yale. And colleges going west, as they went west, if you follow the establishment of colleges across the Midwest and going west, there's a connection to these people who were among the founders who went to these schools established with support by Harvard and Hopkins. And Yale never was here, but the school itself was established by graduates from Harvard. So,
Afterwards, so when Hopkins' trust was being administered, Yale hadn't yet been founded, so...
it was still early on, and so their best bet was to just give it to Harvard, I guess. If they'd gotten there right at the beginning, it would have been named Hopkins University, but they missed out on that too. Anyone else? Yes.
It's interesting, I come from Native, and one of the things we have in the Southern flag is the John Elliott flag, the Northern John Elliott flag, so it's interesting to know praying Indian, which I was supposed to be mostly Native, but bringing them all the way back into the only area I do know, I've heard this Iroquois tribe in Indian, but I don't know how to explain it to all the tribes, that the Native American tribes that existed. I'll tell you, it was Iroquois, and it was praying Indian, a lot.
So the
As far as draft, I didn't know there was something like that.
yeah, and actually, the Nipmuc territory extended across much of central Massachusetts and northeastern Connecticut. And there's a reserve in Grafton, it's 4.5 acres up on Brigham Hill. That's what's left of their native land that's still owned by the natives. So much of their land after the King Philip War was absorbed and settled. There were praying, John Elliott traveled down through Sutton and on down to Webster. He established Chippewa praying village there, and then down into the Quinnipiac Valley. He really got about as far as planning to get out to establish a praying village out in the area of Sturbridge. But the combination of his advanced age and the growing hostilities and the leading into King Philip's War, it kind of died out there. But much has been lost, unfortunately, with King Philip's War. Much of the native culture and tradition was lost. And it's a sad thing. They were an oral tradition. Elliott helped to translate their language into print. The Pequot Museum and down in Connecticut, they're now using the Elliott Bible as a way to bring back the Algonquin language. So that language has been lost. And if you think, you try to understand the impact of an oral tradition culture being obliterated, think of how our world would be if William Shakespeare's works were written. That people just learned them and passed them down orally, and then we got rid of all the actors. What would be lost? The culture had been lost, and we can't recover that. But we can try to at least give acknowledgement of the people who are here. Well, again, I do want to thank you all. They're lined up here with refreshments. They are going to be unhappy if you don't take part in their refreshments. And I want to thank you again. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website